Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on what sheriffs need to know about extreme risk protection orders. My name is Mitch Cunningham. I'm the Chief Law Enforcement Advisor for the National Sheriff's Association, and we are really pleased to be joined by three important guests who will be talking about these risk protection orders, ERPOs, as we'll be calling them going forward. Our first guest is Spencer Cantrell, Assistant Scientist for the Center for Gun Violence Solutions at Johns Hopkins. Also are joined by Lisa Geller, who's Senior Advisor for Implementation, also at the Center for Gun Violence at Hopkins, and a practitioner, a person who's actually using them in the field and will provide just a very valuable perspective and insight for this discussion. That's Sheriff Dawanna Witt from Hennepin County, Minnesota. So thank you, Sheriff, for being a part of this. We will be doing the webinar. You'll be muted, but you'll be able to put your questions in the chat. And at the end, we'll have plenty of time to review your questions and really dig into the things that you are specifically concerned about. So let me talk a little bit about the world that we're in as it relates to ERPOs. We are in challenging times, to be sure. We have seen the rise of political violence. We're seeing a very, very troubling association of disaffected youth that we're struggling with. The FBI has gone so far as to designate them nihilist, violent extremists. Overlaying all of this, we see the rise, the growth of a national mental health crisis. And as always, we are struggling for resources. But this is the world that we're in, and always our community is asking us for answers. They're looking for our leadership to show them the way to make their community safer. So I'm so glad we're having this discussion about these ERPOs. How well are they working? Are they a solution perhaps for your jurisdiction? What does the current research tell us about the impact that they're having in our communities? So with that, I want to switch it over to our two guests from Hopkins to really talk about understanding ERPO laws, what they mean, how well they're working, and really fill in the context about ERPOs. So with that, let me turn it over to Spencer and Lisa.
Thank you so much, Mitt. It's great to be with you all here today and to talk about extreme risk protection orders and the promising evidence that we have about what a life-saving measure they are. Before we get started, we have to read a disclaimer. And while we're doing that, Joe, if you could launch the poll that we have, I would love to know if you are in an ERPO state. So if you could answer that question, well, I just share that this project is supported by a grant awarded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. BJA is a component of DOJ's Office of Justice Programs, which also includes the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Institute of Justice, and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Office of Victims of Crime, and the SMART Office. Points of view or opinions in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. So now that we've gotten those out of the disclaimer out of the way, hopefully you've all had the opportunity to share if you live or work in a state with an ERPO law. So I'd love to see those results and see if we can get that breakdown of how many of you are in an ERPO state. Let's see the results. Okay, so 78% said yes, and 13% said you're not sure. Well, I'm glad that some of you who aren't sure joined us today. You will hopefully have a much better sense of that before the end of the presentation. For those that you are in a state with an ERPO law, hopefully you will leave here with a better understanding of best practices for implementation of ERPO laws, different ideas about how these laws are being used around the country, and some tips and tricks to improve implementation. So let's go ahead and dive into the presentation. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of extreme risk laws, um, working at Johns Hopkins, we always like to root our presentation in public health. And so this is a report some of our colleagues worked on that just shows the scope of the problem of gun violence nationally. And something that might be surprising to folks is that more than half of gun deaths in 2023 in the United States were from suicide. And so more people lose their lives to firearm suicide than to homicide, but both are huge problems in our country. We also know that people lose their lives in the United States to unintentional firearm deaths and to legal intervention firearm deaths. And so, if you scan this QR code, you can read the full report. We welcome you to do that. We also have state by state breakdowns. Some states might have more firearm deaths from homicide than suicide. So you can read more about what the breakdown is in your state and how this might impact different communities differently. But we know that this is a huge problem, but we also know that firearm violence and gun violence, that there are solutions. And one of those solutions that we've identified at the Johns Hopkins and that we work on at the National ERPO Resource Center are extreme risk protection orders. So what are these? Um, Extreme risk protection orders are civil orders which serve to temporarily remove firearm access and firearms from individuals who pose a risk to themselves or others. And these were developed in about 2013 in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting. Um, when a group of researchers, mental health professionals, researchers, policymakers, attorneys all came together and said, what can we do? What steps can we take when we know someone presents a risk? We know that someone needs some time and space between them and their firearms. What can we do to have a legal intervention to give judges legal authority to order the removal of firearms when it's not safe for someone to be in possession of firearms? And so the goal was to create a civil process to remove firearms from individuals who were creating, making threats or presenting that risk. Um, it's a civil process, not a criminal process. Violating an ERPO could potentially be criminal. Um, I will note that before the consortium got together, there were somewhat similar laws in place in Connecticut and Indiana, but they were not completely identical to the modern day ERPO law. And so that's kind of a little bit of background as to why ERPOs were developed. So I'm going to now pass it to my colleague Lisa to share a little bit more about ERPOs and how they work in practice.
Thank you all for joining today. So, as Spencer mentioned, for those who are not familiar or aren't sure if you are in an ERPO state, these laws were modeled after civil domestic violence protection orders, which I would assume that more people on this call may be familiar with, as these laws have existed since the 1970s and are present in every single state. But there's a lot of ways in which ERPOs are different from domestic violence protection orders or civil protection orders, whatever your state calls them. And Spencer's going to share in a couple slides a comparison chart so you can see more of the differences. But I'm going to focus on extreme risk protection orders. Now, these are, as Spencer mentioned, civil protection orders that do include a number of petitioners. And on the next slide, I'm going to show a breakdown of who those petitioners are by state. But every state allows law enforcement to petition. And that's why we really wanted to have a webinar today focused on sheriffs and the role of sheriffs in the ERPO process, because you all play a critical role in this process. I mean, not only petitioning, but more often, serving extreme risk protection orders, removing firearms. And so we want to get into what we've learned, and Sheriff Witt will share as a practitioner her experience with extreme risk protection orders. But other petitioners include family members, household members, healthcare providers, educators, and others. And I'm going to show again on the next slide a breakdown. But the most important thing to take away, I think, from what ERPOs are is that they are only about access to firearms. We do see sometimes judges ordering people to get service or other type of help for the duration of the order, but the nuts and bolts of this law is that they will give judges and give you as law enforcement that clear legal authority to both remove firearms from someone and also will put them on the next background check as a prohibited purchaser were they to go and purchase a firearm for the duration of the order. Like domestic violence protection orders, there's an ex parte or temporary order that typically lasts up to 2 weeks and final orders that typically last up to a year. But we really encourage you to go to our website, ERPO.org, and look at your state-specific page because these laws do vary not only in who can petition, but also how long the temporary order lasts, how long the final order lasts. And some states, for those from Maryland and others that are joining on this call, you have 3 types of orders. So please do make sure you visit our website to figure out the specifics. This is really intended to be an overview of these laws so that everyone can take something away from it. Now, this slide is going to show the breakdown of petitioners. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead one. This is showing the list of ERPO states. So for those who were unsure, those who voted you're unsure, if you live in an ERPO state, I hope that that will clarify this. So we now have 21 states, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. Virgin Islands that have these extremist protection orders as of this month. When we look at the population, we can see that more than 50% of the US population is in a state that has an extreme risk protection order. Of course, you've got some big states there, California and Florida. That's why we don't have 50 or more than half of 50 states, but we have more than half of the US population. And now I will show you this group of breakdowns by petitioners. Most commonly, the petitioners are law enforcement, followed by family and household members. In the dark blue, you can see the states that only allow law enforcement to petition, with the asterisk that there are some groups like attorneys and state attorney generals that are eligible petitioners under these statutes. Again, why it's important to go and look at the actual definition of the petitioners. The groups in dark orange allow law enforcement and family and household members. The light blue is law enforcement, family, household, and clinicians. And then that light orange is an even expanded group of petitioners that goes beyond those and includes educators, and California has coworkers. And so again, we have a lot of different varieties. The commonality here is that law enforcement in every single one of these states are the petitioners, and some states have expanded beyond that. Now, just a couple more slides before I turn it back to Spencer to talk about how these laws work. We do see that extremist protection orders are used in a variety of circumstances. And I think Mitch set the tone right in the beginning of this, talking about the climate that we're in with various forms of violence. And then Spencer showed our annual CDC report that shows the breakdown of gun violence in this country. One reason why we think extremist protection orders are such a good tool is that they can fill a lot of these needs and can really intervene in various forms of gun violence. Now, most ERPOs are used to address threats of harm to self, so for issues of suicidality. And as we saw, more than half of all gun deaths are suicides. So we do have the best available evidence, and I'll get to that a little bit before we turn it over to Sheriff Witt. Then we have that middle of the Venn diagram, that's to threats to self and others. A lot of the petitions I've read look at that intersection. Someone is threatening harm to self and others. And then you have the category on the right that's threat to others. And that could be in a domestic violence situation, workplace violence, school shootings, community violence, and more situations. But the important thing here is that we're looking at behaviors and not diagnoses. Now, there might be a situation where an individual living with mental illness is a respondent to an extreme risk protection order, but that is not what we're looking at. We're looking at individuals who are threatening dangerous behaviors. They're threatening to harm themselves, to harm others. And we're not looking at whether or not an individual has a diagnosable mental illness, because we're not going to get the riskiest group if we're looking just at a diagnosis. So the key takeaway here is that in your jobs in law enforcement, we're going to be looking at who has risky behaviors and how we can intervene. And what are some of those risky behaviors? We have the next slide here, a list of some of the common factors to consider in an ERPO that we see. And those most often include threats of violence to self or others, followed by a number of these other enumerated factors. Now, this is a non-exhaustive list. It's also not a state-specific list. These are just some of the common factors we see. And what you might notice towards the bottom is looking at recent acquisition of firearms or an individual with substance or alcohol misuse problems. those alone are likely not going to be enough to get an extreme risk protection order. We're not just looking for someone who's recently purchased firearms. That would be a complete misuse of the law. But when you start to add up a lot of these factors, and what we say is looking at the totality of circumstances, if you have an individual threatening violence who has a history of violence and they just acquired firearms, you could see how that risk profile would be a lot greater than someone who just has recently acquired firearms. And now I'm going to turn it back to Spencer so we can talk about how these laws work and then get over to Sheriff Witt.
Thanks, Lisa. So we'll just go over the general process because, again, every state's process is going to vary just a little bit. But across the country, generally speaking, the petitioner the person who is eligible to file the paperwork, Lisa went over the list of petitioners by state in that color-coded map. They will fill out the form and say why the respondent or who the order will be against, why that person should not have access to their firearms temporarily. And they will fill that paperwork out and file it with the court. And then a judicial officer, usually a judge, depending on the state, it might also be a commissioner or a magistrate, will review the evidence and the petition and grant or deny that temporary order. If it's issued, then law enforcement will serve the temporary order on the respondent. Typically, that's the sheriff's doing that work, as you all may well know. And then typically the firearms are relinquished at the temporary phase. Usually within 7 to 14 days, depending on your state statute, a final ERPO hearing is held. And so at that point, both parties, petitioner, the respondent, all come to court. The respondent has the right to hire an attorney if they so choose. Everyone presents their evidence, presents their side of the case, and then the judge makes that final determination whether or not to issue a final ERPO, which is good for 6 months to 1 year in California and Delaware, up to 5 years, just depending on your state statute. So just really quick, I know Lisa said that ERPOs are modeled off of domestic violence protection orders, but I want to note that domestic violence protection orders have a lot more holistic and robust relief included in them than ERPOs. DV protection orders, these are called different things in your states, right? Personal protection orders, but they might include a stay away order, a no contact order, a temporary custody arrangement. The ERPO is just about firearm access, right? And so when you're thinking about what relief a domestic violence survivor might need, the ERPO might include more robust firearm relinquishment and removal than a domestic violence protection order. But it's important to note that an ERPO is not going to typically include all of the relief that a domestic violence or IPV survivor might need to be and feel safe. And so when you're thinking about working with IPV survivors, you want to make sure that they are getting the correct relief that they need and the practical safety planning tips that they need. And you also want to make sure that no officers are filing for an ERPO and revealing that an IPV survivor is engaging in help-seeking or safety planning behavior and disclosing to their abuser that they're doing that, right? I would hate for someone to be secretly considering leaving an abusive relationship and then a law enforcement officer file for an ERPO on their behalf and disclose to the abuser that they're doing this and they're not ready to leave that relationship. So that's a much more nuanced conversation to have, but something I did want to flag for folks and more than happy to have a longer conversation about that. I also just wanted to note that due process protections are included in ERPO laws. This is something that we get a lot of questions about when we're doing training in the field. But when Congress was passing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, they decided to take a belt, suspenders, and safety pin approach, right? And say that when states are spending some of the funding that Congress allocated for implementation of ERPO laws, they're going to make sure that all of these due process protections are included in their ERPO laws and programs. And Senator Cornyn went on the record at the time and said that all of the ERPO laws that were passed at that time were consistent with these due process protections. And so we just want to draw your attention to this, that respondents have the right to notice and hearings and unbiased adjudicator, right? We went over that when we were discussing the process, that these due process protections are embedded in the ERPO process. So I'm going to just pass it back to Lisa really quickly just to share a little bit of the ERPO research before we move on to hearing from Sheriff Witt.
Great. So just the last couple slides, we encourage you to get out your phone and scan for more resources, because we're not going to have time to go over them, but we want to make sure you have them. This document is a collection of research on extreme risk protection orders that shows the impact on suicide and other forms of firearm violence. And then we're going to just skip a case study, but we do have a lot of case studies about suicide prevention. This is our website, so please visit ERPO.org, and you'll also find a page about our partnership with the National Sheriff's Association. Specifically, there is a resource for sheriffs and extreme risk protection orders that the National Sheriff's Association put together. You can scan there. I know we're going really quick. And then, lastly, we have a fact sheet for law enforcement as well on frequently asked questions and extreme risk protection orders. All of this is on our website. If you go to ERPO.org, you will find all of it there. And for the sake of time, we are going to hand it back to Mitch so that we can hear from Sheriff Witt. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. That was really, really interesting. And I would just note for the agencies that are doing ERPOs, again, all the data that and research and information Lisa was talking about will help you with obtaining best practices. So there may be things, tweaks and different policy changes you can use to do even a better job than what you're already doing. Okay, so we heard from our folks, our research folks from Hopkins. Now we get to hear from a practitioner, Sheriff Witt, who's actually doing the work and can tell us about her experience, how it's been received, what things she's learned from working on ERPOs. So Sheriff Witt, looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
You're good.
Okay. Thanks everyone for being here. Hope everyone's having a great afternoon. So just first, a little bit of demographics about Hennepin County. One, we're located in Minnesota. Minneapolis is the biggest city in this county. And our population is roughly 1.3 million people. There's 45 cities, and of those 45 cities, we have 36 law enforcement municipalities in the county. And those numbers are going to be, 38 law enforcement agencies. And that's going to be important because here in Minnesota, where we talk about jurisdiction and county versus municipality, our state law was very specific in saying that it can be a municipality or a sheriff's office. But just I'll do a little bit explaining about that here as I speak. So I did hear earlier, what were some of the pushback or what were some of the fears that we had here when ERPO was first brought to Minnesota, which again, we began to enforce them in the beginning of 2024. But first, one of our first fears was that they would be misused, such as disgruntled family member trying to prevent a family member from going hunting or something to that effect. And then second, we also feared that the use of ERPOs would be prolific and a major burden on our staff and resources, such as storage, and then just the dangers of going into people's homes or spaces in which we're not wanted there, and what kind of dangers could that bring onto our staff. I am happy to say that none of those fears did materialize. I'm not aware of the law being misused or misapplied, at least here in Hennepin County, and we haven't seen the volume that we initially expected as far as how many do we have the proper storage space for a population of people of 1.3 million when these things would come up, and we're not seeing that as of yet. So I am happy to report that. Did you want me to just keep going too and talk about my experience, or is there going to be a question?
Yeah, just go ahead and tell us how things are going, how it rolled out, how it all transpired, and then we'll go to questions towards the end.
Okay, thank you for that. So currently, we've had over 300 ERPOs that were issued throughout Minnesota in 2024 and year to date for 2025. 95% were temporarily approved and 78% of the long-term ERPOs were approved. And for those of you who are in different states, in Minnesota, the short term is 14 days, but there is a long-term application where it can be up to a year. And of course, respondents have the ability to go to court and fight those if they so choose to do so. But Hennepin County Sheriff's Office has been the primary agency. 39 of those ERPOs were issued through our sheriff's office since January 1st, 2024. And as of this year, we've had 16 to date. And we have seen success from those. One story that I can tell you about is we were contacted by the University of Minnesota that a student was spiraling out of control. Other students reported that he had become a little bit erratic, I guess you could say, and had observed him playing a video in class and lets players pretend that they are going on a killing spree at a middle school. He also had posted numerous photos of weapons on social media, including one of which showed a rifle on a table at his residence that was overlooking a prominent area of the University of Minnesota buildings. And then so working with our civil attorney, we successfully sought an emergency ERPO and were able to seize that student's firearms. Our attorney then obtained a long-term order for him. I think something that is very important to remember about this is that, ERPOs are temporary orders. And when we think about people experiencing crises, some of those crises are temporary as well. And so it's a way to remove them in a quicker pace so that people don't have as easily access to harm themselves or others. And I think that it's just so important to remember that. But with success stories, there also comes challenges, right? So we recently had an article that was published here in one of the biggest newspapers where a Minnesota judge dismissed 35 ERPOs when either family members or law enforcement failed to show up. And I should say that is something for our state, as you saw on the map before, is that it can be law enforcement and it can be family members who petitioned for ERPOs here in Minnesota. But the article also noted that some people had been discouraged by the process. For example, they were having trouble filling out the proper paperwork. And then we also have proponents of the law that are trying to do more outreach, but the law provided no funding mechanism for statewide training. So for those of you who are looking at going through this process, those would be two things I can say that would be very helpful if you're on the front end of it is training. And our county attorney's office here did a great job with reaching out to law enforcement, making sure we had the proper training and the resources so that we can do this the right way. And so those are some pointers that I would urge those of you who are looking at seeking this to get ahead of. But when I think about ERPO, as far as if we're talking about just the basics in Minnesota, as in other states, the law was intended to temporarily block the gun access, right? Again, and that's something that some people, they totally gloss over, is that it's a temporary block. Again, while somebody is not thinking clearly or going through a crisis. But that ERPO, it directs a person to surrender their firearms and it prevents a person from purchasing firearms while the ERPO is in effect. Although Minnesota does not use the term red flag law, that is essentially what it is. An ERPO may be issued if a person poses a significant danger of bodily harm to others or a significant risk of suicide if they possess a firearm. Something to think about here for all my sheriff's offices is suicide by cop. How many of us have received a report about somebody wanting to die suicide by cop? And that's typically by using firearms. So, I know one of the things that frustrated us here is that when things weren't happening fast enough, ERPO, again, working with your county or your county attorneys, your district attorneys, this is a way to fast track those type of situations. And so, again, it's a good way to go to deal with those crises that we often can't plan for. But with ERPOs being relatively new in Minnesota, again, we began January 1st of 2024. I'd caution that the numbers discussed might be a small sample size compared to states who have had similar laws for longer. But again, as we are new into this process, I think that helps bring clarity if we're talking about what we're seeing, again, in the most populated county in this state. But when we're talking about, again, going to the types of ERPOs, you have the emergency ERPOs, you have the long-term ERPOs. And when we're thinking about emergency ERPO, it's done without a hearing, and it goes into effect right away and can last up to 14 days. And then again, the long-term can only be granted after a court hearing. And with the long-term ERPO, it can last between 6 months and a year, but it can be continued past that hearing if needed. But who can seek an ERPO in Minnesota? I'm sorry, I know that it's different amongst different states, but here for Minnesota, it can be the family, it can be spouses, it can be exes, parents, roommates, people with romantic ties, city, county attorneys. All of those people can effectively request an ERPO, and I think that's actually the better way to go, because when you think about law enforcement, we're usually called in on the back end of things, where it's the family and friends that have that intimate knowledge of what's going on with a person and can recognize what's normal for a person and what's not. So I do like the wide net of people who could issue it. And again, yes, of course, we have to do our due diligence to ensure that that people are not filing these ERPOs out of spite. And again, we have not seen that here yet, although it was a fear of ours. And I can say this, that, ERPOs have gotten a lot more attention here recently in Minnesota because of the 2 high-profile shootings in Hennepin County this summer. In June 2025, the Speaker of our State House of Representatives, Speaker Melissa Hortman, and her husband were assassinated, and another legislator and his wife were shot. 2 months later, 2 children were killed and many more were injured in a school shooting here at Annunciation. And neither case was an ERPO sought, but the high-profile nature of the shootings increased attention around the effectiveness of our ERPO. Like, if I specifically think about the Annunciation shooting, what's one of the first things people ask is, what were the warning signs? What were the warning signs? So again, having that process where people have the avenue to share their concerns regarding their loved ones, their friends, is something that's just very important. And I'm not sure if there's going to be questions right now, or I can keep going.
Yeah, well, you keep going with what you want to tell us, and then I know I have some questions, and I'm sure there's other questions building up in the chat as well. So.
Okay, well, let's talk about who handles what in Minnesota. Again, there's the sheriff's role, there's the police role. When handed an ERPO, we must serve it and seize all firearms within 24 hours. We check homes, vehicles, workplaces, inventory. We inventory the firearms and enter the person's name into NICS to block purchases of more guns. Again, to note that it is a civil order, so there's not a criminal element to this. And I think that's very important for some people. They think, okay, that because they have this, it's bringing them into the criminal justice field. It's a civil matter and a civil process. And so that's something else that I think it's important for people to understand. But I will say that, with it being a civil order and not an arrest warrant, unless the guns aren't turned over, which thankfully has not happened here yet, and I hope that we continue to have that buy-in from people. It's worked very well for us so far. The law enforcement agency with the primary jurisdiction in the cities where the subject of the ERPO lives is responsible for serving the ERPO and seizing the firearms. And when it was enacted here, one of the things that happened to us as a sheriff's office is that in our state laws, there was something that said it needs to be turned over to the sheriff and not necessarily the municipalities, but we got all that cleared up. But there was some confusion there where people were, I should say more of the medical field, was bypassing the municipalities and coming directly to the sheriff's office for that. So that's something else to make sure, if you already have that in law as to whose responsibility is, clarify with your municipalities and your sheriff's office. But however, we did reach a notification when ERPOs were filed. We do get those notifications, and our civil unit then follows up with the city responsible to ensure that that order was being served. So there does have to be follow-up process from the sheriff's offices if it is the municipalities that are in fact serving those ERPOs and then removing guns. But what we do when we receive an ERPO, as far as the sheriff's office, is that we treat them as if we would an arrest warrant. As I said earlier, we contact our criminal intelligence units. They do analysis on the threat assessment. We then assemble a team of our deputies from our patrol and or our civil units to go out and serve the ERPO. And then today, again, thankfully, we have not had any issues with the person not complying with it. But then when we don't seek that search warrant, I'm sorry, we are asked if we would seek a search warrant if somebody does not comply, and obviously we would, and we do a more in-depth threat assessment, and that would likely involve our SWAT team. But that follow-up is good because, again, if it's been filed, there's reason for it. So we do take it very serious as we would with our arrest warrants. I think that, let's see here, I'm trying to see if we have our some of our to-date information, but over 300 ERPOs again in Minnesota. One of the things that people think, well, okay, well, Minnesota, people are enthusiastic about trying to remove guns or things like that. There's 87 counties in Minnesota, and I could say that 39 of the counties haven't had a single petition that has been filed. So, again, that's good if people don't have to file them, but it's a good tool to have in the toolbox if and when you need them. I don't know of too many people who are in law enforcement that can't say that there's ever been that moment that they responded that they felt like they couldn't do anything because the law did not allow us to do anything. And we were often put in positions where we had to wait for something to happen. This is ERPOs are something that allows us to be proactive versus reactive and waiting for things to happen, particularly when there are warning signs that are alerting us that something's not right here. I could tell you for the state of Minnesota, our Minnesota BCA, they reported that we have over 408,000 valid gun permits. With that, we have even more guns, and we're talking about people who should have them, people who should not have them, but we got to think about access to guns when people are not able to make rational decisions for themselves. And remember, crises are temporary. And so we need a temporary process that will help remove those items that could be of danger until people are able to mentally deal with whatever it is that they're going through. With that being said, I think I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, great. That was so comprehensive. Excellent. So we have law enforcement on the line here. And so I'm thinking, as a former deputy chief, what tactics, or how did you approach when you took this on with ERPOs to work with, messaging this to your troops? We know cops, the two things they hate the most are change and the way things are. Mm-hmm. So, how are you able to kind of message and get their buy-in and then work from there?
Well, I think that, again, that there's a lot of people that have been in this line of work who have been on that call where they felt like they could not do anything, even though there were all these warning signs that are available, right? If somebody legally has the right to carry or purchase weapons, we have to think about, sorry, you guys, I just saw that I have a little mask in the background for Halloween. Pay that no mind. I just saw But when you think about those kind of instances, because I know I've had them where you're feeling helpless. This is another tool again that can help us feel more secure, or help secure the situation, an individual, a family, a community. And again, it's not about taking people's rights away for the rest of their lives. We have to acknowledge that people are we're not flawless, right? And people go through things. And this is us trying to help people make sure that they're safe, making sure that they keep themselves safe. And it's something that it's necessary. I feel that it's very necessary. I am very grateful that ERPOs are part of our law here now in Minnesota, because again, I know what it felt like to know where you're hearing family cry and asking for help, and there's nothing you can do because the law doesn't allow it.
Right. Let me ask you this. Any feedback from the mental health professionals that you're working with that are saying, hey, great, we didn't know about this person. We appreciate the opportunity to intervene here in a very, very important moment. How are they receiving the fact that ERPO is now making these connections?
I think as far as from our mental health professionals, that if nothing else, it's helped us bridge that gap better, right? Allowing for that information to be shared, all for the cause, the greater cause of keeping people safe. Right. I think, again, people were calling the sheriff's office more so than municipalities, so it was a learning curve for all of us. But it's nice to know that we all want the same thing, and it can't be our job starts here and ends here, starts here and ends here. It helps have that overlap, which I think is also necessary when it comes down to keeping people safe, whether it's the individual or the communities and things like that. So it was a bonus. Because it helped us build those relationships between that profession as well.
And you had mentioned, I heard you say about families, and a couple of things. Families maybe didn't know that these things were available to them, or were struggling to fill out paperwork and work through the process. What would your thoughts be to help folks now becoming aware of a new tool that they can use maybe in a difficult situation with a beloved family member? Does the sheriff's office, does police play a role in the education and awareness part of this?
If not, they should be. We do. I like to think of, okay, when we think about law enforcement, that's just one action. We're truly public safety servants, and that's about that being a part of public safety in general. Public health and public safety, they're intertwined so much. So if to truly help people, we have to be a part of putting that resource out there. We have to be a part of the messaging. We don't want people fearful because we're involved. It's very important that we are saying that, hey, this is not a criminal matter, this is a civil matter, and we're here to help. But I think law enforcement should very much be embedded in that process. And again, look at it as we're part of the public safety continuum. We're not just here to enforce laws.
Right. Okay, so helpful. A lot of valuable insight from the field. Want to ask a couple questions from our subject matter experts here. Lisa and Spencer, thinking about ERPOs, as you had mentioned earlier in presentation, they come in a few different flavors. Can you kind of talk more about what that looks like and maybe how they differentiate from Sheriff Witt's experience in Minnesota?
Sure. So I would say that some of the variations we've talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So the petitioners really vary across the country, like Lisa described. And then the statutory scheme in terms of timelines also varies. So how long the temporary is, how long the final is, varies somewhat in every state's statute. The burden of proof in every state's order at the temporary stage and at the final stage, that's going to vary in your state statute. We have all of that listed out by state on ERPO.org. At the bottom of each state's page, we have a chart that lays that out, so it's easy to see what's the burden of proof at the temporary and at the final stage. And then Lisa went over during the presentation kind of a generalized list of factors for what we consider when an ERPO might be appropriate. But every state's statute is going to be different in terms of what are the actual statutory factors that you're going to need to articulate to determine whether or not a respondent qualifies for an ERPO. The other thing I would note that really varies across the country is what services and connections are available to a respondent. And a lot of that's going to be vary based on what resources are available in your community. But when Lisa and I are working with folks, we want to make sure that when the ERPO expires, that the respondent is in a better place than they were when that order was initially filed for, right? And that it is safe for that person to be reunited with their firearms. And so that's going to mean different things for different people, right? But are you able to help connect them with employment services? Do they need behavioral health or treatment services? Do they need to be connected with the VA? What services are in your community? What services does that respondent need? And what can you do to put them on a better trajectory so that you don't need to extend that ERPO beyond the initial time period, right? And that's going to vary not just by state, but by your locality. But those are some important variations across the country. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add, Lisa.
I would just add, generally thinking about extreme risk protection orders, I love Sheriff Witt's framing that this is something you want to have when you know someone is at risk of harm to self or others, and previously there wasn't another tool available. That is precisely why most states have adopted these laws. It has been in the wake typically of a mass shooting where law enforcement said maybe they knew someone was a threat to the community, but they didn't have that clear legal authority. I think that that is the gap that extreme risk protection orders are there to fill. So I would just encourage folks to be thinking about this as a prevention tool, someone who is on that pathway to violence, but this is a tool that can get them off that pathway, again, in conjunction ideally with some other services, because just removing a firearm may not be enough to address that root cause. But I think thinking about ways to de-escalate and take folks off of that pathway to violence and thinking about this in that prevention framework is precisely what we do. We're at a school of public health, and that's exactly our framing as well.
Can I add something to that? I apologize.
Absolutely.
Something else that when we're talking about removing barriers, something else that I think is important to share here is that here in Minnesota that there's no cost for filing the petition. You know, again, it's about helping people and giving us the resources we need to prevent tragedies from happening. And so again, for those who don't have it, I think that's very important. Is it should not be a financial cost for people to save lives. And so that's just something I wanted to add to that part.
Well, as we talk about, this connection, this partnership between law enforcement and mental health professionals, one thing I've come to learn is that some agencies have decided to really put a team together around ERPOs and really kind of incorporate almost a threat assessment approach. Spencer or Lisa, if you could talk about what some of those agencies' response looks like for, folks listening, watching this webinar who may decide, we're a big enough agency, this will be a larger undertaking. How do I structure a unit maybe to be charged with addressing this?
Sure. So we've seen a few different models in terms of ERPO units around the country. We've seen ERPO units embedded in threat assessment units, so part of a behavioral threat assessment team. We've also seen ERPO units as part of like a co-responder model where you have social workers going out in coordination with law enforcement to respond to folks. I would say when you're in a more urban area where you have a larger force, that's a lot more feasible than when you're in a rural area where everyone in the department has to wear every hat, right? And so I think that it's important to take those considerations to consider that when you're determining how you're going to structure your ERPO unit. Because, and then some places have their own designated ERPO unit, which really just focuses on ERPO and gets called on anytime an ERPO needs to be filed. And so we've seen, I think those are some of the designated ERPO models when they're in the BTAM or the ERPO or the co-responder. And then some places, it's everyone's responsibility to file for the ERPO. And we've seen all of those different models be successful around the country. It just depends on what makes the most sense in your force, depending on the volume of ERPO cases that you're filing, how specialized folks are, what kinds of cases you're filing for ERPOs in, and whether or not you're filing for the ERPO and doing anything else in coordination with the ERPO. If you're also, some places when they do an ERPO, we've also seen folks in many instances having a behavioral health evaluation. So I think it's really just about determining what makes the most sense in your unit, but being really thoughtful and mindful about that. I will also note that as many departments are standing up their ERPO units, something we've seen be really successful around the country is meeting with some of the other key system actors in your area. So bringing together, the chief, the sheriff, the administrative law judge, the prosecutor, right? And having like a little round table on a regular basis to figure out what's working well, what's not working well, what needs to be ironed out, so that you can all make sure that you're getting those supports and systems in place to make sure that the ERPO system is working well amongst those key collaborators.
Yeah, get a little feedback loop going. Yeah. Right now, I don't have any questions that I'm seeing on my end. So please, encouraging everyone listening, this is a great opportunity to ask folks who really know their topic well and a practitioner. Lisa, let's talk about research. I know you had to kind of hurry through a little bit in touching on research, but I think we've got some time maybe to elaborate on some promising information that seems to be emerging from the use of ERPOs.
Yeah, I'm glad I will have time to talk about that since we had to go quickly through that slide. So in short, we have a lot of research now, and there's more that's going to be coming out over the next year, as I'm aware of many researchers, myself included, that are in the process of writing up some findings of studies from around the country. Now that we have 21 states, we have DC and the US Virgin Islands, that have these laws on the books, many of them for several years. We're getting to the point where we're going to have enough data to be able to evaluate their impact, and certainly to see some of those descriptive analyses. And what I mean by that is who's filing the orders, who are the respondents, what do they look like, where do they live, what age are they, what is the precipitating cause for that extreme risk protection order. We're just getting more and more and more data on this. My estimate is that there's been about 75,000 ERPOs filed across the country in all the states combined. So of course you heard from Sheriff Witt about a couple hundred, 300 for that first year in Minnesota. They've had their law only for a couple years. There's some states that go back now a decade. In January, it'll be 10 years in California. Florida's had their law since 2018. So we have a lot of data, which is great as someone who cares a lot about the data and figuring out how ERPOs are being used. Now, the best available data we have is the impact of ERPOs on suicide prevention. Now, we know that access to a firearm increases the risk of suicide greatly. And so perhaps it's not that surprising that if you restrict access to firearms for someone who is threatening to harm themselves or to harm others, because we know there's a connection between suicidality and homicidality, that we really do see an impact. A study that came out about a year ago from some of our colleagues, some at Hopkins and other institutions, found that it took about 17, for every 17 ERPOs issued, one suicide was prevented. And now that we've seen, tens of thousands of these across the country, I know that lives are being saved. When I speak to law enforcement, when I speak to judges who have a respondent come before them, and then a year later, their ERPO is expiring and they're, first of all, still alive. They have not killed themselves. They have not killed anyone else. And they're on that better pathway. Again, they're off that pathway to violence. We have a lot of evidence also that there's uptake is different both within states and between states. So Sheriff Witt mentioned that of the counties in Minnesota, there's still a large number that have never used an extreme risk protection order. I'm not going to say that's wrong. Perhaps there hasn't been an instance in that county where this has been warranted. But I do think that there is education that's still needed among those key implementers, among law enforcement, among judges about how these are to be used for what circumstances. Again, looking at case studies, we have so many through the ERPO Resource Center. We encourage you, again, to look at our website for case studies, how these have been used in the field. And then we do have emerging evidence about the role of extreme risk protection orders in preventing mass shootings. Our colleagues at UC Davis, who've done a ton of work on California's extreme risk protection order called a gun violence restraining order, looked at cases in which an ERPO was filed for an individual threatening a mass shooting. And what they found in looking at 20 or so of those cases and follow up on that specific respondent was that none of the threatened actions occurred. There was no subsequent suicide or homicide tied to at least 20 mass shooting threats in California during that couple-year period that they studied. So more research is coming out every single day. The research document that I put in the chat is being updated routinely by our team about the best available research evidence. So please do keep clicking that link, and it might be new studies next time you check it out.
Okay. I see one person had noted that the chat's disabled, but again, there's a question and answer box if you can use to put your questions in. Kate Murphy asks, what's the difference with the SAFE Act? SAFE Act. So I'm not sure what jurisdiction it is, but if you folks are familiar with what she's referring to.
Yeah, so I think New York, you can correct me if I'm wrong. If you're
I think you're right, because the next question down references New York. You're absolutely right.
So I'm not going to Kate, please email us to talk more specifics. I think there are a number of states that have SAFE Act type laws or other ways, again, to remove firearms. And there's reasons why those are different from extreme risk protection orders or similar. If there are folks on the call from Illinois, they have something called clear and present danger, where people can file that to temporarily restrict access to firearms. In Delaware, there's the Beau Biden Act that's quite similar to their ERPO, called a lethal violence protection order. But in short, the mechanisms are going to be slightly different. Again, with the ex parte and the final order, sometimes they're different in that they don't go into NICS or NCIC. So I don't want to get too specific into any one state, but I do encourage you to reach out. And I do want to note that states have various laws to temporarily restrict access to firearms. But we're going to be looking here at behaviors, not diagnoses. And a lot of those acts are indeed focused on individuals living with mental health diagnoses or mental illness. And so those are just some of the ways those are different.
Okay. Well, we've just got about 4 minutes left, I believe, in our webinar here. I'd like to give an opportunity to Sheriff Witt if she has any final observations, thoughts, lessons learned that she'd like to share with us.
Thank you for that question, Mitch. I would like to say, if anyone does have questions, as far as how it worked out or more specifics for Sheriff's Office, that feel free to reach out to me. We'll be happy to help anyone along this. As again, I said earlier, I believe that this is a great tool for us to have with that same objective of keeping people safe from themselves and keeping community safe from people when they are experiencing crisis. And that's all that I have. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your participation and your insight. Spencer or Lisa, any final thoughts as we wrap up here?
Just that we are here as a National Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center to be a training and technical assistance provider and support implementers like yourselves around the country for the implementation of extreme risk laws. And so we are here to be a resource. So please do not hesitate to reach out if you have questions about your state's extreme risk law or best practices around ERPOs. We are able to provide our training free of charge and really just here to be a resource. And we partner with the great folks at the National Sheriff's Association, with other law enforcement and other subject matter experts. So we hope that this is the first of many conversations with the great folks on this webinar. And I would also just note that we welcome your feedback. And I've put a link to our survey in the chat, erpo.org/evaluation. So if you have any feedback from this webinar or anything you would like us to include in future webinars, we welcome that if you have just 30 seconds of your time to share.
Well, thank you so much. This has been great. The National Sheriff's Association is so happy to partner with our friends from Johns Hopkins, but also having a practitioner, Sheriff Witt, in the field, giving us her valuable perspective. So this was so interesting, so fascinating, and we look forward to more of these. And for folks who are listening, watching, please give us your ideas. If you want to know more about specific aspects of ERPO or anything else from the National Sheriff's Association, we want to hear from you. We're here to give you the information that you need to protect your communities, and that's always the most important thing. So thank you, everyone. This was so great.